The wind had been rising all evening, the kind that rattles window frames before the snow even starts. By the time the power went out on my block, the street had already disappeared into a pale blur. I was alone in the house, sitting in the dark with only the low glow from the fireplace, the radio murmuring warnings about falling temperatures and dangerous wind chill. I remember thinking that the silence felt controlled, manageable, something I had chosen. Then the doorbell camera chimed softly on my phone. I looked down and saw them. A woman standing on my porch, one arm wrapped tight around a small child, both of them bent slightly forward against the wind. Snow clung to the edges of her coat. The child's hat sat crooked, his cheeks red and raw. They were not pounding on the door. They were just standing there waiting. I did not move. I told myself it was late. I told myself it was not safe. I told myself I had no obligation to open my door to strangers in the middle of a storm. The woman shifted her weight, adjusting the child higher on her hip. She pressed the bell again, not harder, just once more, as if reminding me that she was still there. I felt a tightening in my chest that I did not want to name. Instead of getting up, I reached for the porch light switch and turned it off. The glow outside vanished, leaving them in shadow. I watched through the camera as the woman looked up, confusion passing across her face. For a moment, she seemed to accept it. She turned her body, slightly shielding the child from the wind as if preparing to leave. The radio crackled with another update. Emergency shelters were closing due to power loss. Roads were icing over. Stay indoors if at all possible. I sat back on the couch and told myself I was doing the sensible thing. Then the child looked straight into the camera. He did not wave. He did not cry. He simply stared, his eyes wide and steady, and said something I could hear faintly through the speaker. "Mom says knocking is what brave people do." The words landed heavier than the storm outside. The woman froze, clearly mortified, whispering something to him that I could not hear. She reached for the door again, hesitated, then knocked softly with her knuckles instead of using the bell. I could have stayed still. I could have let the moment pass. No one would have known. But my body had already betrayed me. I stood up before I decided to. I walked to the door slowly, my hand resting on the wall as if the house itself needed to steady me. I did not open it. I slid the chain lock into place and cracked the door just enough to let a thin slice of cold air rush inside. The woman stepped back immediately, her eyes alert, cautious. She did not push forward. She did not ask to come in. "I am sorry to bother you," she said, her voice tight but controlled. "Our door is broken. The wind keeps pushing it open. My son is cold. I am not asking to stay. I just do not know what else to do tonight." The child leaned forward slightly, peering past me into the dim hallway. He was quiet now, his small hands gripping his mother's coat. I felt exposed, standing there like the door had opened something in me that I had kept sealed for years. I nodded once, a meaningless gesture that bought me time. I did not invite them in. I did not refuse them either. The snow whipped harder around us, stinging my face through the narrow opening. Somewhere down the street a branch cracked loudly, then another. The woman shifted again, her arms trembling from the effort of holding the child so tight. I realized then that my silence was not neutral. It was a decision. I looked at the chain lock at the thin barrier I had placed between us and understood how small it really was. My hand slid to the handle. I wrapped my fingers around it and felt the cold metal bite into my skin. I stood there breathing, listening to the wind, knowing that whatever happened next would change something I could not put back the way it was. The door stayed chained as I opened it a few inches wider enough to let my voice carry without inviting anyone to step closer, and the woman noticed immediately, her shoulders relaxing just enough to show she understood the boundary and respected it. She introduced herself quietly, her name spoken like something fragile, and then she nodded toward the child, who did not wait for permission before leaning forward again. He studied me with open curiosity, not fear, not need, just the simple attention children give when they are deciding whether someone is real or not. I expected him to ask for warmth or food or shelter, the things adults always ask for when the night turns dangerous, but instead he tilted his head and said, "Your light went off." His mother flushed, murmuring an apology, but I shook my head, unsure why I felt compelled to explain myself to a child. The wind pushed hard against the door from behind them, forcing me to brace my foot against it, and the child noticed that too, pointing down at the warped edge of the frame. "That is what keeps happening to ours," he said. "It does not like the wind." The woman tightened her grip around him, her jaw set as if she was bracing for rejection she had already accepted. I told them I could take a look at the door, nothing more, and I watched the calculation in her eyes as she weighed risk against necessity. She nodded once, crisp and careful, and stepped back to give me space. I grabbed my coat and tools without inviting them inside, closing my own door behind me as if I needed the physical reminder that this was temporary, controlled safe. Outside, the cold hit harder than I expected, and the child noticed that too, watching my breath fog the air. "Are you cold?" he asked, genuinely concerned, and I almost laughed at the reversal, the way he had turned the situation upside down without meaning to. I said I was fine, though my fingers were already stiff, and followed them down the steps toward their house, which sat only a few doors away, but felt farther in the storm. Their front door rattled as the wind surged, the latch barely holding, and the woman stepped in front of it instinctively, her body becoming the barrier. I knelt to examine the hinge, feeling the weight of the moment settle heavier than the snow on my shoulders. The child crouched beside me close, but not in the way, watching my hands with intense focus. He did not ask questions adults ask. He did not want explanations. He narrated instead, commenting on the sounds the metal made on the way the door jumped when the wind hit it just right. "My mom says doors are supposed to keep bad things out," he said, and then added after a pause. "But sometimes they get tired." The woman swallowed hard and looked away, pretending to adjust the porch mat while I tightened screws that should have been replaced years ago. I worked slowly, deliberately, aware that rushing would only make things worse, and aware, too, that I was being watched not with suspicion, but with a strange, disarming trust. When the door finally settled, no longer shaking under the wind, the child clapped once, sharp and delighted, then caught himself and went quiet again. He stood up, brushing snow from his knees, and looked at me as if evaluating something important. "Do you live alone?" he asked. His mother stiffened, immediately apologizing before I could answer, but the question lingered between us, heavier than any request. I told him yes because it was easier than explaining the rest. He nodded, considering that answer carefully, then looked back at the door. "It is good you came out," he said. "My mom does not like asking." The woman closed her eyes for just a second, and I felt the air shift, something opening that I had not planned for. I stepped back, giving them space again, and told her the door would hold for now, though it was not a permanent fix. She thanked me without enthusiasm or relief, just a steady acknowledgement of help received, and I reached into my pocket, instinctively pulling out cash before thinking better of it. She saw the motion and shook her head immediately. "No," she said, firm but not angry. "We do not do that." The child frowned at the exchange, then tugged gently on my sleeve. "Do you have paper?" he asked, as if the night were not collapsing around us. I blinked, caught off guard, and told him I did. He smiled small and bright and said, "I want to draw something while the door rests." The storm surged again, the lights flickering in the distance, and the woman looked at me with a question she did not ask. I realized then that I had not just fixed a door. I had stepped into a space where leaving felt heavier than staying. I stood there longer than necessary, tools still in my hand. The wind pushing snow sideways across the porch, as if the night itself was impatient with all of us. And in that pause, I felt something uncomfortable settle in my chest, the understanding that not speaking was no longer neutral. It was a choice that carried weight. The woman adjusted her grip on the child again, shifting him from one hip to the other, and I noticed how carefully she moved, as if conserving energy, as if every motion had already been calculated hours ago. The child did not seem bothered by the cold in the way adults are. He watched the world with a strange calm, his eyes following the way snow collected at the base of the steps, the way my breath came out uneven now that the wind had cut through my coat. He looked up at me and asked nothing, and somehow that silence pressed harder than any plea could have. The radio warning echoed faintly from inside my house, carried through the cracked door I had left behind, words about temperatures dropping fast, about the danger of exposure for children, especially about roads becoming impassable before morning. I knew those warnings were meant for everyone, but standing there, they felt aimed directly at me. The woman cleared her throat softly and said she understood if I needed to go back inside, that she was grateful for the door being steadier now that they would manage. She said it the way people do when they have already accepted the worst outcome and are trying to keep their dignity intact. I nodded again, that same useless nod, and felt ashamed of how often I relied on it instead of saying what I meant. I could tell her no. I could tell her I had done enough. I could retreat behind my door and convince myself I had been helpful without taking on any responsibility beyond what I had planned. The storm made those thoughts feel smaller, thinner, as if the cold were stripping excuses down to their bare bones. The child reached down and pressed his gloved hand against the bottom of the door, testing it like he had earlier, then looked back at me. "It still shakes," he said quietly. "Not like before, but a little." His mother inhaled sharply, her jaw tightening, and I saw the effort it took for her not to step in front of him, not to shush him or apologize again. I realized then how carefully she had taught him to speak, not to beg, not to accuse, just to state what he observed. That kind of honesty was harder to ignore than any desperate request. I opened my mouth to respond, then closed it again, feeling the words get stuck somewhere behind my ribs. The truth was, I did not know what to offer that would not cross lines I had drawn for years. I had learned to keep help compartmentalized, limited, transactional. Fix the problem, step away, return to quiet. But the problem in front of me was not contained to a hinge or a latch. It was the space beyond the door, the night that did not care how careful I wanted to be. The woman finally spoke again, softer this time, and said there were warming centers earlier, but they had closed when the power went out. She said the buses had stopped running, that her phone battery was almost gone. She said it without drama, listing facts the way someone does when they are trying not to panic. I listened and said nothing, and with every second that passed, my silence grew louder. I could feel the child watching me again, waiting not for an answer, but for a sign the way children do when they sense something important is being decided. I thought about my porch light, about how easily I had turned it off to make the world simpler, darker, easier to avoid. I thought about the chain on my door, about how thin it really was, about how it had given me just enough distance to pretend I was still in control. The wind slammed into the door again, harder this time, and for a moment the latch groaned in protest. The child flinched just a little and leaned closer to his mother. She wrapped her arm tighter around him, her body angling instinctively toward the door, toward the threat she could not fully keep out. I felt something in me shift then. Not courage, not generosity, but responsibility. The quiet understanding that choosing nothing was still choosing something, and that choice would leave them alone with a storm that was not slowing down. I stepped closer, my boots crunching on the icy porch, and placed my hand flat against the door, feeling the vibration of the wind through the wood. "It will hold for now," I said finally, and the words sounded inadequate even as they left my mouth. The woman nodded, but her eyes searched mine for something else, something steadier. I hesitated, then added that if it got worse, if the door failed again, she could knock. She looked at me carefully, as if weighing whether that offer was real or just polite noise, and asked if I was sure. I did not answer right away. I looked back toward my house, at the darkened porch, at the light I had chosen not to share, and felt the weight of that earlier decision settle heavy and undeniable. "Yes," I said, and meant it more than I had meant anything else that night. The child smiled, then, not wide, not excited, just a small easing of his face, and I understood that the moment had already passed a point of no return. Silence had been an option once. Now it was no longer available to me. I did not invite them inside, and the woman did not ask, which told me more about her than any explanation could have. Instead, I offered what felt like the narrowest possible step forward, the kind that did not rely on trust or gratitude, but on logic and boundaries. I told her I could reinforce the door from the outside a little more, add temporary brackets, and seal the worst of the gap, and that I would keep my own porch camera on while I worked. I said I would not come in, not even to warm up. She listened carefully, her eyes never leaving my face, weighing every word, and then she nodded once, firm and controlled. "That is fine," she said. "That is enough." The child did not comment right away. He held his gloves together in front of his chest and watched as I went back to my house to gather more tools, the wind howling louder now, the storm no longer patient with half measures. When I returned, the woman had positioned herself just inside the doorway, one foot braced against the doorframe as if she were part of the structure holding it together. The child stood close to her, his hat pulled down low, his breath coming out in short white bursts. I knelt again, my knees protesting against the frozen wood of the porch, and began working more carefully this time, tightening what I could, sealing cracks with what little material I had on hand. My fingers burned from the cold, but I did not mention it. The child noticed anyway. "Your hands are shaking," he said, not accusing, just observing. I told him they would warm up soon, and he nodded as if that answer satisfied him. The woman watched every movement I made, not hovering, not interfering, but alert in the way someone is when they have learned that help can disappear as quickly as it arrives. I understood then that this was why she had agreed, not because she trusted me, but because the help I offered did not require her to lower her guard. I worked slowly, deliberately, making sure each adjustment held before moving to the next, aware that rushing would only undo the fragile sense of stability forming around us. The wind slammed into the door again, and this time it barely moved. The child smiled, a small sound of relief escaping him before he caught himself and pressed his lips together as if joy were something to ration. "It is quieter," he said. The woman exhaled long and controlled the kind of breath you take when you have been holding tension for hours without realizing it. She did not thank me right away. Instead, she asked if the fix would last through the night. I told her it should, though I could not promise more than that. She accepted the uncertainty without complaint, nodding again, already adjusting her expectations. I stood up slowly, my legs stiff, and stepped back to give them space, the storm swirling around us in sharp, biting gusts. The child looked past me toward my house, its dark porch barely visible through the snow, and then back at his own door. "It is warmer inside now," he said, but then added after a pause, "Still lonely." The word landed unexpectedly, not because it was dramatic, but because it was simple and true. The woman stiffened at his side, her mouth opening slightly as if to correct him, then closing again when she realized there was nothing to correct. I felt a pull then, a dangerous one, the urge to fill that loneliness with something larger than I could safely offer. I stepped back further instead, grounding myself in the limits I had set. I reached into my pocket again, the instinct to offer money rising automatically, and this time I stopped myself before she could see. I told her to knock if the door failed again, reminded her that my porch camera would be on all night. She studied me searching for signs of obligation or pity, and when she did not find them, her shoulders eased just a fraction. "Thank you," she said finally, not as a social reflex but as a statement of fact. The child tugged gently at her sleeve and whispered something I could not hear. She nodded, then looked at me and said he wanted to draw something while the door rested. I hesitated, then told him he could use paper from my place if he wanted. He looked up at me surprised, as if the offer had not occurred to him, and then smiled, quick and bright, before remembering himself and returning to that careful quiet. I brought the paper out to them instead of inviting them in, setting it on the porch railing between us, another small boundary that mattered. The child sat cross-legged on the porch floor, shielding the paper from the snow with his body, and began to draw with focused intensity, his gloved fingers awkward but determined. The woman watched him with an expression that softened despite her effort to keep it contained. I stood there, the cold creeping deeper into my bones, and realized that this was the help she could accept. Not warmth borrowed from a stranger's house, not promises or reassurances, but presence that did not ask her to give up control. The storm roared around us, the night pressing in from all sides, but for a moment the door held, the drawing took shape, and the space between us felt steadier than it had when I first turned the porch light off. I waited while the child drew, telling myself that once he finished, I would hand the woman some cash, wish them well, and return to my quiet house, the night neatly compartmentalized into a problem solved. But even as I formed the plan, I knew it was a lie I had told myself too many times before. The storm had not eased. Snow continued to pile against the steps, and the wind slipped through every gap it could find, testing the repairs again and again as if determined to expose their limits. The child's drawing took shape slowly, his movements careful, deliberate, like someone who understood that rushing would ruin things. The woman stood just inside the doorway now, one hand resting against the frame, her eyes alternating between her son and the street beyond, alert to any shift in sound or shadow. I reached into my coat pocket, feeling the familiar shape of folded bills, and stepped closer, holding them out without ceremony, without explanation. "This should help for now," I said, keeping my voice steady, already preparing myself for the relief that would follow when the exchange was complete. She looked at the money, then at me, and shook her head once sharp and immediate. "No," she said, not angry, not offended, just firm. "We do not take money like this." The words surprised me, not because people do not refuse money, but because of how easily she did it, how little drama she attached to the refusal. I tried again, telling her it was nothing that it would make things easier, that it was simply practical, but she did not move. She did not lecture me. She did not explain her values. She simply repeated herself quieter this time, as if the conversation were already over. "I do not want my son to think help only comes with cash," she said. The child looked up from his drawing at the sound of her voice, curious but not alarmed, and then went back to his work as if this exchange were part of the background noise of the world. I felt something tighten in my chest, a recognition that stung more than rejection ever could. Money had always been my way out, my way of closing doors without slamming them, of leaving situations without leaving myself exposed. I realized then that I had offered it not for her benefit, but for mine. I stepped back, slipping the bills back into my pocket, suddenly unsure of where to put my hands. The child finished his drawing a moment later and held it up carefully, shielding it from the snow as if it were something fragile. He did not present it to his mother first. He turned toward me instead, his expression serious, and asked if I wanted to see it. I nodded, crouching down to his level, and he held the paper out between us. The drawing was simple, uneven lines and bold colors pressed hard into the page. 3 figures stood in front of a door, the shapes unmistakable despite their simplicity. One was small, one was taller, and one stood slightly apart, closer to the door than the others. Above them, the child had drawn a single light glowing bright against a dark sky. I did not ask which one was me. I did not need to. My throat tightened as I stared at the figure closest to the door, realizing that in the child's mind I was already part of the scene, whether I deserved to be there or not. The woman noticed the change in my expression and looked over, her face softening as she took in the drawing. She said nothing, but her eyes lingered on the paper longer than necessary, as if committing it to memory. The child folded the drawing carefully, pressing the creases down with his small gloved fingers, and held it out to me again. "You can keep it," he said. "So, you remember the door?" I did not trust my voice to answer, so I nodded and accepted it, tucking the paper carefully into the inside pocket of my coat, where it would not bend. The wind surged again, and the door rattled though it held, and the child looked back at it, his earlier confidence wavering just a little. The woman straightened instinctively, placing herself between him and the door, and I felt the pull again, that dangerous urge to offer more than I could sustain. Instead, I reminded her that the fix should last through the night and that she could knock if anything changed. She listened, nodding, not hopeful, not resigned, just prepared. "Thank you for fixing it," she said, and then, after a pause, "Thank you for staying." The distinction mattered more than she probably knew. I stepped away, then retreating toward my own porch, the snow crunching under my boots, and glanced back once to see the child watching me with that same steady curiosity. He lifted his hand in a small wave, then dropped it quickly, as if unsure whether the gesture was appropriate. I waved back before I could stop myself. Inside my house, the cold felt sharper than before, the quiet less controlled. I removed my coat and stood by the door for a long moment, listening to the storm and thinking about the folded drawing pressed against my chest. I had thought money would end it, that it would allow me to step back into the life I understood, but instead it had exposed something I could not ignore. I realized then that this night was not going to resolve itself cleanly, that the door I had fixed was not the only one under strain, and that walking away now would feel heavier than staying ever had. I told myself I would go back inside and stay there, that the night had already taken more from me than I was prepared to give, but instead I found myself standing in my entryway, staring at the door that led to the garage, the one space in my house that had never quite become anything other than storage. a place I kept functional but emotionally untouched. The storm raged outside wind, scraping against the siding like restless fingers, and in that noise I heard an excuse forming a practical one, the kind I trusted. The garage had a portable heater. It was separate from the main house. It was not intimate or welcoming. It was controlled. I grabbed the heater, an extension cord, and a flashlight, then stepped back into the cold without overthinking it, afraid that if I paused too long, I would lose whatever fragile resolve had pushed me forward. The woman looked surprised when I returned, not suspicious, just momentarily unsure of what this meant, and I explained quickly that the garage space could give them a break from the wind if the door started acting up again, that it was detached, visible from the street, and that I would stay outside while they warmed up. She hesitated, scanning the space with the eyes of someone trained to identify exits and risks, then nodded, pulling the child closer as they stepped inside the bare concrete room. The heater hummed to life, pushing out a thin stream of warmth that felt almost insulting compared to the comfort of a real home. But the child relaxed immediately, his shoulders dropping as if his body had been holding tension he did not know how to name. He looked around with interest, taking in the shelves, the boxes stacked neatly along the walls, the absence of anything personal. "It smells empty," he said, not accusing, just observant. The woman smiled faintly at that, the kind of smile that comes when you recognize a truth you had not planned to say out loud. I stood near the open door, the cold pressing against my back, determined not to cross another line without reason. The child wandered closer to the shelves, his fingers trailing along the edges of boxes labeled in my handwriting dates and contents that meant nothing to him. He stopped suddenly and crouched down, peering at a large cardboard box pushed far back against the wall, its surface coated in a fine layer of dust. "Why is this one dirty?" he asked. I froze. That box had been there for years, untouched, deliberately ignored. I had arranged everything else around it so I would not have to move it, so I would not have to confront what was inside. The woman noticed my reaction immediately and called him back gently, telling him not to touch things that were not his, but the damage was already done. I walked over slowly, my boots echoing too loudly in the small space, and brushed my hand across the top of the box, leaving clean streaks through the dust. It had been a long time since anyone had asked about it. I told him it was old stuff, nothing important, and expected that to be the end of it. Instead, he nodded thoughtfully and said, "Old things get cold if you forget them." The words hit harder than the wind ever could. I did not respond. I crouched down and adjusted the heater, giving myself something to do, something mechanical and safe. The woman watched me closely now, not intruding, not demanding, but present in a way that felt heavier than any question. The child sat on the concrete floor near the heater, holding his hands out in front of him, his fingers still red despite the warmth creeping back in. He looked up at me again and asked if the space was where I slept. I shook my head and told him no, that it was just a place for things I did not use anymore. He considered that and then asked if that meant they were gone. I opened my mouth, then closed it, realizing how easily that question slipped past all my practiced defenses. The storm roared outside, rattling the garage door, and I wondered briefly if the noise would cover the sound of my breathing, which had grown uneven without my permission. The woman finally spoke, her voice gentle but grounded, and said they did not want to impose that they could go back to their house now that the door was steadier. I nodded, relief and disappointment tangling together in a way I did not fully understand, and told them that was fine, that the heater could run a little longer if they wanted. The child stood up slowly, brushing dust from his knees, and glanced once more at the box before turning away. As they stepped back out into the storm, I lingered behind, staring at the space they left at the heater, humming uselessly against the cold emptiness of the room. I realized then that I had never intended this space to be warm. Not really. It had always been a place to keep things I did not know how to integrate into my life. Things I could not throw away but refused to acknowledge. I shut the heater off and stood there in the dim light, my breath visible in front of me, and finally pulled the box out from the wall. The tape cracked loudly as I opened it, the sound startling in the quiet garage, and I saw what I had known was there all along. Small items carefully packed, a child's jacket, a single shoe, a faded drawing folded in half. I did not pick anything up. I did not need to. I closed the box again slowly, the dust settling back over it like a familiar blanket. When I stepped outside, the storm felt different, not less fierce, but less distant, and I understood that the space I had never kept warm was not just the garage. It was the part of myself I had locked away, believing that distance equaled safety. As I watched the woman and child make their way back toward their house, the light from my porch still dark, I felt the weight of that realization settle in my chest. I knew then that whatever came next would not stay contained to tools and temporary fixes. Something had already been disturbed, and it was not going to let me retreat quietly again. I stayed outside longer than the cold, justified watching the woman and her son disappear into the curtain of snow. My mind still caught on the box in the garage, and the quiet way the child had noticed it without touching, without prying, as if he understood that some things announced themselves without needing to be opened. When I finally went back inside, I did not turn the porch light on. I stood in the dark entryway, coat still on, listening to the wind batter the house, and realizing that the silence I usually relied on felt different now, thinner, as if something had cracked beneath it. A few minutes passed before I heard the knock again, softer than before, tentative. I opened the door with the chain still in place, my body already tense, and saw the woman standing there alone. This time, her face drawn but steady. She said the door was holding for now, that the heater had helped, and that she only wanted to thank me properly before the storm worsened. I nodded, unsure how to respond, and that was when the child appeared behind her, peeking out from the shadow of her coat, his eyes finding me immediately. He stepped forward just enough to be seen and asked if I had fixed the cold box. The question caught me off guard, sharp and unexpected. I told him no, that I had just looked at it. He nodded slowly as if that answer made sense, and then said something that unraveled me faster than anything else that night. What was his name, he asked. The woman inhaled sharply, already preparing to intervene, but I raised a hand, slightly stopping her without looking away from him. I knew exactly what he meant. He did not need to specify. The name had been sitting in my throat since the moment the box shifted heavy and familiar. I could have deflected. I could have told him it was not important, that it was private, that some questions do not need answers. Instead, I felt the weight of the night press down on me. The storm, the broken door, the drawing folded in my pocket, and I realized that refusing now would not protect anything I had not already lost. I swallowed and said the name out loud, my voice quieter than I intended, the syllables rough from disuse. The sound of it seemed to hang in the air between us, fragile and exposed. The woman did not react outwardly, but I saw the shift in her eyes, the immediate understanding that comes when someone recognizes grief without needing details. The child repeated the name, softly testing it, then nodded once satisfied. He did not ask what happened. He did not ask where the boy was. He did not ask why the box was cold. He simply looked at me and said, "That is a good name." I felt something give way in my chest, a tightness I had carried for so long that I had mistaken it for structure. The woman reached for her son's hand, grounding him gently, and thanked me again this time, with a weight that acknowledged what I had just offered. As they turned to leave, the child paused and pulled something from his pocket, unfolding it carefully before holding it out to me. It was the drawing he had made earlier, the 3 figures in front of the door, but now he had added something small in the corner, a box with a line drawn through it like a window. For him, I guessed. "So it does not get colder," he said, and placed it into my hand before retreating back to his mother's side. They stepped into the storm again, and I closed the door behind them, the click of the lock sounding louder than usual. I leaned back against the wall and stared at the drawing, my fingers trembling as I traced the uneven lines. I had avoided saying that name for years, believing that silence was a form of respect, that not speaking it kept the pain contained. Standing there with the storm raging and a child's handwriting warming the paper in my hand, I understood how wrong I had been. Avoidance had not preserved anything. It had only kept me frozen in place. I folded the drawing carefully and placed it beside the other one in my coat pocket, feeling their weight settle against my chest like a reminder I could not ignore. Somewhere down the street, the wind howled louder, testing doors and windows again, and I wondered what would happen if theirs failed once more. I found myself listening for that sound, now alert in a way I had not been earlier, aware that the night had shifted from something to endure into something that demanded attention. I did not know yet what I would do if they knocked again. I only knew that hearing the name spoken aloud had changed the shape of my silence, and that whatever came next would not allow me to retreat behind it again. The sound did not arrive all at once. It slipped in the way cold does when a door is not sealed properly, slow and quiet, until it settles somewhere deep you cannot ignore. I had just set the drawings on the kitchen counter and turned the kettle on more out of habit than thirst when I heard it drifting through the walls, thin, at first almost mistaken for the wind. It was a voice small and unsteady, rising and falling without rhythm, carrying a melody that kept losing its way and finding it again. I stood still, hand hovering above the kettle, listening as the sound grew clearer, separating itself from the storm outside. The child was singing. Not loudly, not confidently, but with the earnest persistence of someone who sings because silence feels heavier than getting the words wrong. He sang from memory, the tune bending under unfamiliar lyrics. Syllables skipped, others repeated as if he were building the song piece by piece in real time. The sound moved through the night and reached me before I could prepare for it. My chest tightened sharply, breath catching in a way that startled me. I leaned against the counter, gripping its edge, trying to steady myself as the song pulled at something I had kept buried beneath years of routine and restraint. It was not the song itself that broke me. It was the way he sang it. Off-key, uncertain, brave. The same way my son used to sing when he was young, standing on a chair in the living room, convinced that volume could make up for accuracy. That effort mattered more than perfection. I closed my eyes, but the memory did not soften. It sharpened. I could see the way he used to wrinkle his nose when he forgot the next line, how he would glance at me for help, without stopping, trusting I would be there to catch him if he fell. The kettle began to whistle shrill and insistent, and I turned it off with a shaky hand, the sound of it colliding with the song outside, until my head felt too full to hold either. I sank into a chair and pressed my palms against my eyes, but the image stayed. The sound stayed. The child outside reached the end of the verse and started again, determined, his voice cracking slightly as the cold bit at him. I did not realize I was crying until the tears slid down my face and dropped onto my hands, hot and unexpected. I had not cried like that in years, not openly, not without permission from myself. My shoulders shook once, then again, and I let them, the collapse arriving without warning or defense. I did not try to stop it. The sound outside continued steady and unaware, and in that strange mercy I was allowed to break without being seen. I thought of all the nights I had sat in this house convincing myself that control was the same as safety, that keeping everything contained would prevent further damage. Hearing that child sing through the storm tore through that illusion with quiet precision. I was not in control. I never had been. I had simply been hiding from the noise that reminded me of what I lost. When the song finally ended, there was a brief pause, a breath, and then laughter, light and brief, followed by the woman's voice, low and soothing, telling him it was good that he did well. I wiped my face with the back of my hand, embarrassed even alone, and took a long, uneven breath. The sound had done its work. There was no putting it back where it belonged. I stood and walked to the window, peering through the frost-etched glass toward the street. I could not see them clearly, only the vague outline of two figures near a door, the porch light dim but steady. I opened the door before I could think better of it, stepping onto the porch without a coat, the cold shocking against my skin. The woman turned first, startled, pulling the child closer until she recognized me. I did not speak right away. I could not trust my voice. The child looked up at me unbothered, curious, and asked if I liked the song. I nodded once, then again, the motion small but sincere. I told him it was my favorite, even though that was not entirely true. What I meant was that it had become my favorite the moment he sang it into the night. The woman watched me carefully, reading the signs I was no longer hiding well, and for the first time, she did not step back. She stayed where she was, letting the moment unfold without interruption. The cold seeped into my feet, but I did not move. I stood there, exposed in a way I had avoided for years, and realized that the sound had not just broken me. It had opened something. The child smiled satisfied and tucked his hands back into his sleeves, already done with the performance. The storm continued its assault, but the night felt different now, altered by a few wrong notes, and the courage it took to sing them anyway. I swallowed and said there was something I had never told anyone, the words leaving my mouth before I decided to release them. The woman did not ask what. She simply waited, and in that waiting, I understood that whatever came next would change the course of this night in ways I could no longer control. I did not invite them inside right away. That would have felt like another kind of lie, a gesture too big, too fast, as if I were trying to cover what I had just exposed with something generous and clean. Instead, I stood on the porch with them while the storm pressed in from every direction, the cold biting through my socks, the wind tugging at the edges of the moment, daring me to retreat. I told them we could stand under the awning for a minute, just to get out of the worst of it, and the woman nodded, her posture still guarded but no longer closed. The child leaned against the wall, humming to himself, finished with the song and already moving on as children do, while I searched for words that did not excuse me, did not soften what needed to be said. I began simply without drama, without framing myself as the center of the story. I told them I had a son. I told them his name again, slower this time, letting it exist in the air without flinching. I said he was born during a summer storm, the kind that floods streets and turns the sky green, and that he used to love the sound of rain because it made everything feel closer together. I stopped there, breathing through the pause, aware of how easily I could shape this into something that earned sympathy instead of truth. The woman did not interrupt. She did not nod encouragingly or offer comfort. She let me continue at my own pace, and in that restraint, I felt something loosen further. I told them that when my son was still small, I learned how to leave without anyone noticing. I learned how to stay late at work, how to answer calls instead of bedtime questions, how to tell myself I would make it up to him later. I did not blame anyone else. I did not talk about circumstances or pressures or intentions. I said what mattered. I chose other things. I said that sentence plainly, and the weight of it settled in my chest. The child looked up at me, then curious but not alarmed, and asked if I had come back. The question landed softly but struck deep. I shook my head once and told him no, not in time. I said the word accident, but I did not linger on it. I did not describe sirens or hospital rooms or the exact moment I failed to answer my phone. Those details did not belong to them. What belonged was the truth that followed. I said I survived, and after that, I stopped letting myself feel anything that could reach that deep again. I built walls that worked. I built routines that did not ask questions. I built a house that stayed quiet no matter how loud the world got outside. I did not look at the woman when I said this. I stared instead at the darkened street, the snow piling against the curb, the way the storm erased edges until everything looked the same. I told them that tonight, when they knocked, I saw them clearly on the camera. I told them I turned the porch light off on purpose. I did not soften that either. The woman inhaled sharply, but she did not step back. She tightened her grip on the child's hand and waited. I told them I thought staying hidden was the safest choice, that doing nothing would keep everything exactly as it was. I admitted that I knew it was wrong even as I did it. The child frowned slightly, processing this, then said that sometimes he hides when he breaks things because he is scared to make it worse. The simplicity of that observation nearly undid me. I nodded, grateful for the translation. Yes, I said, that is exactly it. I was scared of making it worse. The woman finally spoke, then her voice steady, not accusing. She said she understood fear like that, understood how it can convince you that distance is the same as protection. She did not tell me I was forgiven. She did not tell me it was okay. She simply acknowledged what I had said and stayed present, and that was enough. I reached into my coat pocket and pulled out the drawing the child had given me earlier, unfolding it carefully so it did not tear. I showed it to them, the 3 figures in front of the door, the box in the corner with the line through it. The child smiled pleased and explained again that it meant the cold would not get in. I asked him why there were 3 people, not 2. He shrugged as if the answer were obvious and said because someone had to help. The sentence landed without judgment, without expectation, just a statement of how he saw the world. I felt the truth of it settle somewhere deeper than guilt. The storm surged again, louder now, and the woman glanced toward their door, worry flickering across her face. I told her the fix I had done would hold for a while, but not forever. I said I could come back in the morning to reinforce it properly with better tools if she wanted. I made sure to add that she did not have to say yes, that she could call someone else, that there was no obligation attached. She considered this, then nodded once, slow and deliberate. That would help, she said. Thank you. The child stepped forward and pressed the drawing into my chest, flattening it there with his palm as if sealing a promise. Keep it, he said. So you remember? I closed my fingers around the paper and nodded, unable to speak for a moment. They turned, then heading back toward their house, the child skipping slightly despite the cold, and I watched them go without retreating into the dark. I stayed on the porch until their door closed and the light inside steadied. For the first time in years, I did not feel the urge to lock myself away from the night. I went back inside, slowly leaving the porch light on, and stood in the entryway, listening to the storm with a new awareness. I had stopped hiding not because I had been forgiven, not because anything was fixed, but because I had finally told the truth without trying to control what came next. Outside, the wind howled, but somewhere beneath it, the night felt lighter, as if dawn had already begun moving toward us. Morning arrived without ceremony. There was no soft glow breaking through the clouds, no symbolic silence after the storm. The wind was still loud, the snow still falling sideways, and the street looked the same as it had the night before, buried and indifferent. I woke early out of habit, my body trained for productivity even when there was nothing scheduled, and stood at the kitchen window with a mug of coffee I barely tasted. Across the street, their porch light was still on. That small detail stayed with me as I pulled on boots and a heavier coat, gathering the tools I had avoided using for years because they reminded me of responsibility rather than distraction. When I crossed the street, I did not knock right away. I waited, letting the sound of my presence announce itself, respecting the boundary we had not discussed, but both seemed to understand. The woman opened the door with caution that did not offend me. It felt earned. The child appeared behind her, already dressed, eyes bright despite the early hour. He asked if I had slept. I told him yes, which was mostly true, though sleep had come in short pieces, interrupted by thought rather than noise. I got to work without narrating it, crouching near the damaged frame, replacing the temporary fix with something sturdier. I worked slowly and deliberately, explaining only when asked, careful not to turn the task into a performance. The woman stayed nearby but did not hover. She trusted the process without trusting me fully, and I respected that balance. The child handed me screws one by one, proud of the roll, his fingers still pink from the cold. When the door finally settled into place with a solid click, nothing dramatic happened. No cheer, no applause. The woman tested it twice, nodded once, and said it felt better. That was all. I told her I could check the back door as well, but only if she wanted. She considered, then declined, saying one thing at a time was enough. I accepted that without argument. Before leaving, I mentioned the local hardware store had emergency discounts during storms, that there were community numbers she could call if something else failed. I wrote them down on a scrap of paper and handed it to her, making sure she understood there was no expectation attached. She thanked me not warmly, not coldly, but with a steady seriousness that matched the morning. I walked back across the street and went inside, the quiet returning but no longer absolute. The rest of the day unfolded without revelation. I answered emails. I joined a call I had postponed. I shoveled the front walk because it needed to be done. Each action felt ordinary, and that ordinariness mattered more than any imagined transformation. In the afternoon, I noticed the child watching me from their window as I worked. He waved. I waved back, a simple exchange that required no interpretation. Later, a neighbor I barely knew asked if I had power restored yet. I said yes. That was the extent of our interaction. By evening, the storm had eased but not ended. The woman came over briefly, standing on the edge of my porch rather than stepping inside, and returned the scrap of paper with the numbers circled, saying she had saved them in her phone. She did not stay. The child peeked around her leg and told me the door was quiet now. I nodded and said that was good. When they left, I did not feel the urge to follow or to withdraw. I cooked a simple dinner and ate it standing up, listening to the radio update conditions without reacting. Nothing miraculous happened. No surge of hope, no sudden belonging. Just the steady continuation of the day with one small difference. I noticed myself listening more carefully to sounds outside. I noticed the porch light across the street turning off at a reasonable hour. I noticed my own light still on. The next morning, the child called my name from the sidewalk, testing it, and I answered without hesitation. That felt new. The woman asked if it would be all right to text me if something went wrong again, emphasizing that she would understand if I said no. I told her yes, that she could. I added no conditions. She nodded, storing that answer away without gratitude or relief. Over the following days, nothing changed quickly. I did not insert myself into their lives. I did not offer meals or money or solutions beyond what was asked. I fixed one more loose hinge when requested. I pointed out a draft that could wait until spring. I showed the child how to test a door for soundness by listening rather than pushing. Each interaction was brief, contained, and intentional. I learned the value of restraint the hard way, understanding that presence meant showing up when invited, not when convenient. One evening, as the sky darkened early again, the woman stood on her porch and asked a question that carried more weight than it seemed. "If the door breaks again," she said, "would it be all right to call you first? Not because you have to, but because it would help me feel less alone." I did not answer immediately. I felt the familiar urge to measure the cost, to predict outcomes, to protect myself from responsibility by keeping the answer vague. Instead, I remembered the light I had turned off and the sound that had broken me. I told her yes, simply yes. No miracle followed. The night did not soften. The world did not reward the decision. But when I went back inside and locked my door, I realized I did it out of habit rather than fear. I left the porch light on without thinking about it, and for the first time, that small choice felt like enough. It did not happen all at once, and that was the point. There was no moment where I woke up and decided to become someone else. No clear line where the past stopped and something better began. What changed was smaller and slower, the kind of shift you only notice after it has already settled into your days. Showing up became something I did without thinking about it, the way you reach for a light switch in the dark without needing to look. The first time was practical. The woman texted to say the door made a noise again when the wind picked up, not urgent, just an observation. I replied that I would come by after work. When I arrived, I stayed outside, tools in hand, keeping the boundary intact. The child sat on the steps watching closely, asking questions about screws and hinges and why some wood swells in the cold. I answered simply, not as a teacher, not as someone trying to impress, just as a man doing a task. When I finished, the door was quieter, not perfect but better. I left without lingering. The second time was smaller still. A light over their porch flickered, and I noticed it before they did. I mentioned it in passing, offered to fix it if they wanted. The woman hesitated, then agreed. I replaced the bulb and adjusted the fixture, making sure it pointed outward, not inward. Safety without intrusion. The child clapped once when the light came on properly, then lost interest immediately. Life went on. Over the weeks, these moments accumulated without ceremony. I fixed a loose step for an older neighbor 2 houses down because I had the tools out anyway. I helped another replace a broken latch after hearing about it at the mailbox. I did not announce these things. I did not frame them as favors. I simply did them because I was there. People began to nod at me when I passed, not with gratitude, not with suspicion, just recognition. The woman noticed too. One afternoon, she said she appreciated that I did not make things awkward, that I did not act like she owed me anything. I told her I understood that feeling better than she might think. We did not elaborate. The child started calling me by my name without asking permission, testing it the way he tested everything, seeing if it would hold. I let it. Hearing my name spoken easily without weight, without history attached, felt strange at first, then grounding. It reminded me that names are meant to be used, not locked away. There were days I did not see them at all. Days when work consumed me again, when old habits tugged at my attention, when the pull of isolation felt familiar and tempting. On those days, I noticed something else. I noticed that the porch light across the street still came on at dusk, that the door held steady in the wind, that the small repairs we had made continued to do their quiet work. That steadiness mattered more than constant presence. Showing up did not mean hovering. It meant being reliable when needed and absent when not. One evening, the child ran up to me while I was unloading groceries and told me a story about school that made no sense, filled with tangents and dramatic pauses. I listened without correcting him. His mother stood a few steps back, watching, her posture relaxed in a way it had not been when we first met. She trusted the space between us now. That trust did not feel like a gift. It felt like a responsibility I intended to keep. Winter stretched on. Snow melted into slush and froze again. The street returned to its usual rhythm. Then one morning, almost without realizing it, I marked the date and understood that nearly a year had passed since the storm. The realization did not bring sadness or relief. It brought perspective. I had not transformed. I had not erased what came before. I had simply stayed. The woman invited me to a small gathering. The neighborhood organized nothing formal, just coffee and folding chairs in a garage with the door open for light. I attended without fanfare. The child introduced me to people as the man who fixes doors. I did not correct him. During that gathering, someone asked how long I had lived here. I answered honestly. Long enough, I said. Later that night, the woman asked if I ever regretted opening the door. The question was quiet, not loaded, but it deserved a careful answer. I told her I regretted not opening it sooner, but that regret did not control me anymore. She nodded, accepting that without needing reassurance. The child tugged on my sleeve and asked if I would come by the next day to look at something he had built, a contraption of wood scraps and tape that he insisted was important. I said yes. Not because it was important, but because he was. That night, as I locked my door, I realized I had not thought about whether I should. The motion was automatic neutral. I turned off the interior lights and left the porch light on, as I had been doing for months now. Across the street, theirs was on too. 2 steady points in the dark, not signaling anything extraordinary, just marking that someone was home. Showing up had become a habit, not a sacrifice, not a performance. It had not fixed everything. It had not healed all wounds, but it had created something durable out of small, repeated choices. And as I stood there looking out at the quiet street, I understood that this was what repair actually looked like. Not a single act, not a moment of redemption, but the decision to remain available when the world tested the doors again. I did not wake up one morning and decide to leave the door unlocked. It happened the way most meaningful changes do, quietly and without ceremony, until one day I realized the motion was gone. The habit had faded. The night I noticed it was ordinary. No storm, no warning on the radio, no urgent knock. Just a clear evening with the street washed in amber light and the sound of distant traffic humming like a steady breath. I had finished dinner alone, but not lonely, the kind of alone that feels chosen rather than imposed, and as I moved through the house turning off lamps, I passed the front door and hesitated. My hand reached toward the lock out of reflex, then stopped. I stood there longer than necessary, listening to the house settle, aware of how different this pause felt from the one a year earlier when fear and avoidance had frozen me in place. This time, there was no tension in my chest, no calculation. I simply did not feel the need. I left the door as it was and went upstairs. The next morning, I expected to feel foolish, exposed, but instead, I felt rested. Not just physically, but internally, as if something had loosened that I had been holding tight for decades. Over the past year, the neighborhood had changed in small ways that mirrored my own. People talked more. They fixed things together. They watched out for one another without announcing it. The woman and her son were no longer defined by the broken door that had brought us together. Her house was warmer now, not just from repairs, but from the way she carried herself, steadier, more certain. She had found work that fit her life instead of breaking it, and she spoke about plans without apology. The child grew taller, louder, more confident, still curious, still asking questions that went straight to the heart of things. He came by often, sometimes with a purpose, sometimes just to sit on the steps and talk about nothing in particular. I learned to listen without trying to solve. On the anniversary of the storm, the neighborhood organized a repair day, not because anything was wrong, but because we had learned that maintenance mattered. Tables were set up, tools shared, coffee passed around. I did not lead it. I did not fund it. I simply participated. Someone asked why I kept my porch light on all night, now half joking. I shrugged and said it helped people see where they were going. That answer felt true enough. Later, as the sun dipped low and people began to pack up, the child handed me a new drawing. It showed a row of houses, each with a small light by the door, connected by a line that ran across the page. In the corner, he had written my name carefully, spelling it right this time. I thanked him and placed the drawing inside, next to the others that had accumulated over the months, each one a marker of time rather than memory. That evening, the woman stopped by briefly to return a tool she had borrowed. She did not linger. She did not need to. Before leaving, she looked at the door and smiled a small, knowing expression. I realized she had noticed too. We did not comment on it. Some things do not need explanation. When night fell, the street settled into its familiar quiet. Lights flicked on in windows. Doors opened and closed. Somewhere down the block, laughter carried briefly before fading. I stood at my window and watched, aware that this view no longer felt like a barrier between me and the world, but a connection to it. I thought about the man I had been, the one who turned off the porch light to avoid responsibility, who believed that staying hidden was safer than being seen. I did not judge him harshly. He had done the best he could with what he understood at the time, but I was no longer him. Leaving the door unlocked did not mean inviting danger or abandoning caution. It meant trusting the patterns I had built, the relationships formed through consistency rather than intensity. It meant accepting that safety is not created by isolation, but by presence, repeated over time. I went downstairs one last time before bed and glanced at the door again, still unlocked, still quiet. I turned off the hallway light and headed upstairs, carrying with me the understanding that some doors are fixed with tools and screws, and some are fixed by the simple act of choosing not to close them anymore. The difference is subtle but lasting. As I lay down, I felt no urge to check the lock. No need to reassure myself. The house held, the street held, and for the first time in a long while, so did I. Before you scroll away, sit with this for a moment. Not the storm, not the broken door, not even the ending, but the quiet space right after the space where nothing is happening and yet everything has already changed. That is usually where stories end, but for people like us, that is where the real questions begin. You watched a man admit he almost did nothing. You watched him choose presence over comfort, responsibility over distance, and small action over perfect timing. And maybe you watched it quietly, without reacting, without commenting, without telling anyone it touched you. That is all right. Some stories are not meant to be reacted to loudly. Some stories are meant to be carried. You might be thinking about a moment in your own life right now, a night you remember, a call you ignored, a knock you pretended not to hear, not because you were cruel, but because you were tired, unsure, afraid of what opening that door might require from you. Many of us learned to survive by locking things away. We learned that staying safe sometimes meant staying distant, and no one teaches you how to tell the difference between protecting yourself and abandoning someone else. The man in this story did not start as a hero. He started as someone who turned the porch light off. And that is why this story matters. Because it does not ask if you are a good person. It asks a harder question. What do you do when being decent costs you something? What do you do when the right choice is inconvenient, uncomfortable, or emotionally risky? The truth is, most of us are not waiting for a dramatic moment. We are waiting for a small one, a moment where we choose to show up when no one is watching. A moment where we fix something simple instead of making a promise we cannot keep. A moment where we stay a little longer than planned. This story is not about saving someone. It is about staying. It is about learning that money does not end responsibility, that words do not repair damage, and that presence repeated quietly can rebuild what years of absence broke. If this story stirred something in you, it may not be because you see yourself as the man who opened the door, but because you recognize the man who almost did not. And that recognition is not shame. It is an invitation to look at your own life and ask where you still have time to choose differently. It does not have to be big. It does not have to be tonight. It does not require you to fix everything. Sometimes it is as simple as answering. Sometimes it is just not turning away. And if you are watching this channel, it may be because you believe that those moments still matter, that kindness does not need an audience, that second chances do not expire just because time has passed. This space is for people who are still willing to reflect, to feel, to admit quiet failures and even quieter hopes. You do not need to explain yourself here. You do not need to perform gratitude or optimism. You only need to recognize that stories like this are not entertainment. They are reminders. If you believe there are still doors worth opening, still hands worth holding steady, still small repairs that can change the shape of a life, then you are welcome here. Subscribe, not because the stories are dramatic, but because they are honest. Stay, not because everything ends perfectly, but because healing rarely does. And if you ever find yourself standing in front of a door you once kept locked, remember this. It is not too late to turn the light back on.